Please take your seat. The program will be starting soon. Welcome to Politico Playbook First 100 Days. Please welcome Politico's executive producer of events, North America, Annie Allen.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to see you here. This is the second installment of our Playbook First 100 Days Breakfast series, where we are featuring policy leaders and political power players talking about the important issues of the day. So last week we kicked off with tax reform. I think some of you were here for that. Healthcare, energy, agriculture coming up. We have an event on trade next week. And today we are diving into immigration. We're going to discuss the current and future state of immigration policies amidst a blitz of ICE raids and arrests this week, with key leaders in the push for bipartisan immigration talks. We are going to be joined by Senator Mark Kelly, who's a key leader in the push for Senator Mark Kelly, who's a key leader in our push for bipartisan immigration talks, and America First Policy Institute's Chad Wolf to discuss the Trump administration's newly implemented policies and the resources needed to do that. So I'm going to welcome Senator Mark Kelly and Congress Bureau Chief and my colleague Rachael Bade. Thank you. Okay, don't trip.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm here with Arizona Senator Mark Kelly to talk about how Democrats may reposition themselves on immigration following 2024 and where he thinks his own party can maybe play on this issue, even with Republicans.
I thought we were going to talk about the astronauts stuck on the space station.
That actually might be a more intriguing topic. Everywhere except in this town, where politics is everything, of course. But before we get into Democrats, we got to start with Trump, President Trump, given all the recent headlines on immigration. We have seen ICE raids this week. Hundreds of arrests were made this past weekend, and we expect those numbers to rise. President Trump, to be clear, is doing basically exactly what he said he was going to be doing. But what is your initial reaction to sort of what you are seeing on TV?
Well, I think, first of all, enforcement of our laws, it's very important to do that. I think there's a difference between what we previously talked about, immigration enforcement, ICE enforcement, and an ICE raid. And I think an ICE raid, to me anyway, when you're going into a school or in a community, you do it very publicly with cameras, you're looking for a photo op. And you're looking to intimidate people. When you, I was thinking about this the other day with the flight to Colombia, the attempted flights to deport Colombians who were here illegally. Why do you use a C-17 airplane? C-17, I spent 25 years in the Navy flying airplanes. C-17 burns about 20,000 pounds per hour of gas. Commercial airliner like a 737, 5,000 pounds. So you're going to fly a plane that burns 4 times the amount of fuel, that carries fewer people. You're only doing that for one reason, and that's for the image of using the military to deport individuals, when traditionally we just do this with commercial flights that are chartered, and it's much less expensive. So I think the ICE raids that we're seeing around the country is just more of that.
You think it's for show?
I think a lot of it is for show, because the last administration, the one before it, the Obama administration, would do deportation flights rather frequently, and pretty high numbers as well. So I think this is, partly what you say, it's Donald Trump trying to look like he's fulfilling a promise, but at the same time, it's more about the media and the attention. And it's also a little bit about intimidation. When you're going into communities and you're essentially looking for people who are not criminals, with the exception of they broke the law coming into the country. During the campaign, Donald Trump frequently spoke about how we're going to deport the worst people, violent felons,
right.
Criminals. My understanding is about 50% of these people right now have committed no crime other than being here undocumented.
That's actually where I was going to go next, because as you said, ICE and President Trump said initially they're going to target potentially dangerous criminal aliens, but they're sweeping in, as you said, hundreds of undocumented immigrants who don't appear to have, violent backgrounds. Now, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt yesterday was asked about this.
And by the way, I'm all for that. I mean,
well, that's what I was going to go. But
focus on the violent people. Focus on the gang members.
So the White House Press Secretary yesterday said that, well, she was asked about this, and basically her response was, oh, they're all criminals because they crossed the border. Do you agree with that sort of the way she had framed that?
I mean, technically, if you broke the law coming into this country, but that's not the way he spoke about this before the election.
So should they pass over?
Last Monday, there was a change.
So do you think they should be passing over people and only picking up, people who have, these violent convictions?
Well, when there are violent people out there that are undocumented, if you want to keep, the whole idea is we want safe communities. I think the focus should be on those individuals.
Just to play a little devil's advocate here, you mentioned in your first sort of response that you felt like a lot of this was for show, potentially for intimidation. People who support President Trump might argue that, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should be trying to deter people. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that could work. I mean, I don't disagree with the effect that this could have on individuals that are trying to come to our country. Hey, let me back up a second. So I am from Arizona. I represent Arizona. We're a border state.
Right.
Public safety, border security, very important to me. We work very hard in the Senate to try to get agreements with across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, working together in a way that'll help secure our borders, but also have some reform to our immigration system that'll help support our economy. We want to protect dreamers and farm workers. And there's a lot of this stuff that we agree upon and that we can do together. Mm-hmm. ICE raids into schools, scaring kids when the plan was to go and look for criminals. I think this is kind of flipping the script on the American public.
You mentioned schools. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller was asked about this yesterday, and he said the reason ICE should be able to go into schools is actually to, quote, protect children. He said some children have been trafficked and brought here illegally and could be in a bad situation. Do you buy this rationale?
I think that's possible on maybe a very small number of cases, but I don't think that's what they're doing. I think this is more about intimidating communities.
Is there anything you can do as a senator to, besides obviously use your voice, to push back on this?
Well, I could work together with my Republican colleagues to try to come up with real reforms that are lasting. One of the problems with not doing this through legislation and doing things through executive orders, as the president just did, he signed a bunch of them the day he was sworn in, is that stuff doesn't tend to last. Same is true when you pass legislation just along party lines in the Senate. It's likely that when the Senate flips and you get somebody new in the White House, that some of that stuff gets undone. Right. But when you work together across the aisle and you get support from both parties, that's the kind of legislation that stays in effect for long periods of time.
So I want to get to how you can work with Republicans going forward, but before we do that, I actually want to look backwards a little bit because, as much criticism, as you might have for Trump on this issue, the American public, by and large, has showed that they had more criticism for your own party on this issue in particular. Poll after poll, we've seen voters trust Donald Trump and Republicans more than Democrats on immigration. What do you think your party did wrong the past 4 years?
Well, I think this, the Biden administration did some things that were very effective, changing some policies on asylum and the number of folks who could cross between ports of entry. When it got up to above a certain level, then it got shut down. You had to go to the ports of entry, use the CBP One app. That came very late.
Did very late.
Yeah, I pushed the administration over and over again on a bunch of stuff to get the numbers down to help Border Patrol. Border Patrol agents have a really, really hard job. They're under-resourced. We needed to hire more Border Patrol agents. We needed to give them money for overtime. We needed to get them out into the field where they're not just processing people. And I had a lot of success on, certain things. As an example, trying to add some barriers, some, if you want to say, Trump wall in certain places where Border Patrol really wanted it and needed it. My attitude has always been to listen to the Border Patrol agents, listen to Customs and Border Protection about what do they need. It was hard to get the administration to do those things until the very end. At the end of the administration, they implemented a bunch of stuff through executive action. You saw the number of undocumented folks crossing the border went down dramatically. The numbers were actually lower at the end of the Biden administration than they were at the end of the first Trump administration. So we know what works, and you can do this in a way where in accordance with our ethics and principles as a country and our values, and not vilify immigrants and not separate parents from their children. We never want to do that. That's a disaster. Kids do not get over that. So we can do these things, but I would say I think it just took too long.
So you felt that Biden did not listen to the border officers and border officials. You had to
Well, I think
intervene.
the action that he took was just, it could have been done at the beginning of the administration.
Right.
And this, it wouldn't have solved the problem, because to solve the problem,
You need Congress.
we need legislation, and it needs to be bipartisan legislation.
Which leads me to my next question. So Biden basically left it to Congress for a long time to try to pass this bipartisan border deal, which we all know President Trump, then candidate Trump, tanked.
Or former President Trump tanked.
Former and future President Trump.
There you
Okay, got it. But do you think that President Biden, obviously you just said he should have done more, should he have acted unilaterally to, for instance, reinstate Title 42, close the border? Should he have been, like Republicans were pushing?
Biden?
Biden.
Well, Title 42 was a public health, tool, right? And then when COVID numbers got down, it's like, well, why do we still have this thing? Now, you could do some stuff that could also help in reducing the number of folks that are coming across the border without documentation, asking for asylum, and that was done by putting in these, these limits on numbers. If the numbers got above a certain amount, well, we're going to shut down the ability to come across the border between ports of entry and seek asylum until they went down to a much lower number.
How else could Democrats sort of reposition themselves on immigration to show the country that, they found religion on this,
Well, I think it's different for different people. Representing Arizona and spending a lot of time at the border and seeing what the Border Patrol, has to do with what I think is relatively limited resources. They don't have enough people. They don't get paid enough. They don't get overtime. They don't have the technology that they want and need. They don't have the, the fence or the barriers exactly where they want them, and sometimes they wind up, it gets forced on them in certain places where they look at this and they go, well, that's a big waste of money to put that border wall in this area. Why did you do that? Why didn't you give us, other technology in certain places or spend that money on fentanyl detection machines at ports of entry. So I think it's different for different folks. I agree with my Republican colleagues on a lot of this stuff, but not everything.
Yeah.
You know, I think we need an immigration system that protects dreamers. I mean, just think about this for a second. You've got all these people, in some cases, they didn't even know they were born in another country. They come here, they're 3 months old or they're 2 years old. They go to school in the United States. They have families here, and somehow they're not part of us. I think that's ridiculous. You know, I think there should be a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. I think we also need to protect farm workers. Very important to our food supply, to our economy. And by the way, that's not just Democrats who will say that.
A lot of farm district Republicans.
Well, Republicans
right?
too, just in general. I mean, I talk to my Republican colleagues about dreamers all the time. Many of them feel the same way that I do about it. But this issue, unfortunately, is an issue that if you talk about it in an election cycle, it can help you get elected. That's one of the problems with trying to solve this. But we do find a lot of success, sort of, if we can get there, when we work together and we come to an agreement on a lot of different items. We demonstrated just recently, 6 months ago, that we can get pretty close to some comprehensive border security reform. And I think if we were able to get that across the finish line, that would have presented an opportunity for immigration reform, which we really need.
I'm going to come back to this idea of bipartisan border and immigration reform, but first, when we talk about Democrats repositioning themselves on immigration, you were recently one of 12, I believe, Senate Democrats.
13.
Pardon?
13. But
okay.
Doesn't matter.
You were one of 13 Senate Democrats who voted for the Laken-Riley Act.
Oh, no. That was 12.
Oh, okay.
You're right.
He's just confusing me. Voted for the Laken-Riley Act mandating detention of undocumented individuals accused, basically accused of a crime. And yet, when this passed Congress, well, I should say, and yet last year, when Republicans wanted to bring this to the floor, Chuck Schumer didn't want to bring this to the floor in the Senate after it passed the House, right? First of all, do you think that was a mistake? Should you guys have voted on it last year?
I don't know. It was, I actually don't even remember what time of year that was, but it might have been when we were working on the bipartisan border security bill and trying to get that across the finish line, or maybe it was before that. I think in any week, I'll tell you, first of all, this is like the craziest job I've ever had. And I used to fly a spaceship for a living. I used to also fly off of an aircraft carrier. And this is kind of the craziest, chaotic place that has wild rules about how the United States Senate works. You know, if NASA had the rules of the United States Senate, the rocket ship would never leave the launch pad.
It does make your eyes glaze over.
So it's sometimes hard to figure out all the strategy behind certain things.
But to go back to the bill, a lot of progressives were actually upset that some Democrats supported this bill. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib accused people like yourself of, quote, giving into racist fear-mongering at the first opportunity to pass legislation to scapegoat immigrants and to fuel hate in our communities. What do you make of progressives who say that?
I disagree.
Yeah.
I just disagree with that.
Isn't this the perfect example why Americans don't trust Democrats on immigration? If you cannot round up people who have committed a crime.
Crimes. Yeah, if somebody commits a crime, you arrest them. And now technically they've committed, they're undocumented, they commit a crime. Makes sense to me. I think it makes sense to most Americans.
So you're not giving in to,
doesn't make sense to every member of Congress.
So you're not, quote, giving into racist fear-mongering here?
No, I don't think so.
Do you think
that's not who I am?
Do you think Democrats who are saying stuff like this are actually hurting the party going forward and not understanding the need to realign on this issue?
Especially in the House, people represent different groups of people, different districts. A district in, the middle of Arizona, much different than, a district in outside of Seattle. So you try to do your best, at least I do, to represent my state, represent the people of my state, but also consider the big picture and what this means to our country. I sit on the Armed Services and the Intelligence Committees, so national security is a big deal for me. And I think border security is part of national security.
Let's talk about that big, beautiful bipartisan deal you think we're going to get next year. I know you said you didn't think we were going to get. You want to get next year.
Well, we almost got it last year.
You almost got it last year. So you're one of several Democrats who sent this letter to John Thune saying—
13. That's where the
13 is. Okay. Telling him, consider a bipartisan immigration bill rather than sort of jamming a partisan bill through Congress using reconciliation. And obviously the logic behind this is, you know, number one, you would want a bipartisan bill, first of all. But number two, reconciliation has limits on what policy changes you can make because it's a fast-tracking process. It has to have certain budgetary effects, big budgetary effects. And if they can't prove that, it gets cut out of reconciliation.
Yeah, think of reconciliation as it has to have to do with spending or taxes or the debt ceiling.
Right.
And if it doesn't touch one of those things, you can't do it. So you really can't do policy in reconciliation, or it's really hard.
So where do you think Democrats could find agreement with someone like Stephen Miller on this? I mean, I know you mentioned—
With Stephen Miller?
Well, he's running immigration out of the White House.
Yeah, that's another branch of government. So
it is. So first you start with Republicans.
Let's hold on a second. We're the United States Congress. In the Senate, there is strong, we can find bipartisan agreement on this issue. We did it 6 months ago. We got within a day or maybe 2 days from passing that legislation. Now, the Republicans do have the option of going it alone on this.
Right.
But when you go it alone, you can't do everything you might want to do, so it would benefit them as well to work with us, because they could get some things in there that they can't do through the reconciliation process. It also tends to last longer, and the next administration isn't going to undo it because this is bipartisan legislation.
If you had your ideal bipartisan bill right now, what would it look like right now? Pathway to citizenship for dreamers, ag
Yes.
workers.
Yes.
What does it look like?
Well, those things would be high on my list. I try to live in the real world. We didn't have that in the agreement we did last year.
Trump has talked about dreamers.
He has said it, and maybe he would be open to that. But first, we got to get something through Congress. So not only do we have to get it, passed in the Senate, we then have to have the House pass it.
Right. Good luck with that.
But things change. Always.
I mean, if the president—
I'm an engineer. You know what, like the second law of thermodynamics is?
Oh, I don't know any of that.
Yeah.
Woo.
Basically, like unfortunately, things get more chaotic, but doesn't have to be that way. But there's like constant change.
Well, the thing is, if you get President Trump and Stephen Miller, for instance, to lean into this, you are more likely to get it through the House.
That is true.
What have you heard back from Leader Thune, or are there any Senate Republicans who have talked to you?
He said a couple things publicly. I talked to my Republican colleagues about this. Obviously, they're over in the House. They're trying to figure out what this budget reconciliation is going to be. It's rather chaotic over there. Normally, when you're talking about this, what this legislation is going to look like, what they can get in, what they have to try to get in, his tax proposals extending, the big giant tax cut to millionaires and billionaires is something they really want in there that's really expensive. So there's a lot of, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of chaos in the House right now about what reconciliation is going to look like.
Right.
And then this would be something that they would try to work on through budget reconciliation. And it's when you're in the majority, it's your option to do this. You can go it alone, but I will continue to encourage my Republican colleagues that we can do something that's better, more long-lasting, if we work together on it.
Is there any plan to put together a plan B, privately, quietly, in case this fails?
I am talking to some of my Republican colleagues about that.
Okay. Last thing for you, I have to ask you because this is news of the day and not immigration, but it deals with you, deals with all the members of the House. So in light of this recent freeze of congressionally approved federal funds, I'm curious if you feel the need that Democrats need to sort of vote against Trump's nominees or, you know, an OMB director, for instance, that might be coming to the floor soon, to get him to clarify and stop this freeze, which this is congressionally approved money. Congressionally
Approved, appropriated, you know, all spending is supposed to start actually in the House of Representatives. You know, James Madison, I think, you know, decided how this was going to work in the Federalist Papers, right? So, and this is in conflict with that. I'm not totally shocked that things like this are happening. Judge intervened yesterday on this, so there's going to be a delay. It's trillions of dollars when you consider spending on Medicaid and Meals on Wheels and SNAP and all these, you know, programs. It's very, very disruptive. In my state, the number of calls we got yesterday, people are confused, they're scared. The Medicaid portal was shut down. So if somebody's trying to get Medicaid reimbursements, you know, that's not going to happen right now unless we get those.
It's still down, is your
I don't know if
understanding?
it's still down.
Okay.
I came here first. I'll find out
Yeah.
when I get back to the office. Maybe it's back up. What happens on Monday? This is a lot of like chaos into our country. And by the way, if this, let's say a court upheld this and all this government spending got cut off, you think the last recession we had was bad? I mean, we're going to find ourselves economically in a really tough spot. Now, you know, I agree we've got to do something about our spending and our revenue and the debt and deficit. I'll tell you what we shouldn't be doing is another $4 trillion in tax cuts for the biggest corporations and the wealthiest Americans. That's a bad idea. That's what they're trying to put in the reconciliation bill. Yeah. But to answer your question, should we? I don't know. I think any president, President Trump deserves to have people in these jobs. We are better served as citizens of this country when you have, you know, effective and qualified people who care about the mission, who are serious people in these roles. So could that be floated as a strategy to send a message? Sure, we certainly could do that.
Sounds like you're not a big fan of it, though.
I think, you know,
Two separate issues.
Two separate issues, yeah. But you know, he has nominated some qualified people for some of these positions, and then there are some that are not. You know, so maybe we focus on those folks.
It just raises the question, though: how do you cut a debt deal and a spending deal with President Trump if he's claiming authority to spend however the hell he wants? And
taking away a role that has, for 250 years, has been the role of the United States Congress. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not taking away his powers, his job. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's, you know, our government was set up this way for a reason. But, you know, folks, you know, voted for him, and I think they were expecting, based on the, you know, first term, a little bit of this, like, chaotic period in the beginning, especially. But I imagine the courts are not going to let this stand.
Thank you for your time. That's all the time we have, Senator.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. And the deep dive on immigration policy continues as our White House reporter, Myah Ward, sits down with former acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and executive director of America First Policy Institute, Chad Wolf. Thank you.
Ooh, these are so high.
Spread out.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for being here today. I'm Myah Ward, a White House reporter here at Politico. We have Chad Wolf, former acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security under President Trump during his first term. And he is here today to provide insider knowledge and expertise about the process behind the newly implemented policies under the Trump administration. And of course, there are a number of anticipated actions ahead on the immigration policy front as well. So Secretary Wolf, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So as Rachael discussed, in the last panel with Senator Mark Kelly, ICE has really, descended on cities across the country, and President Trump has already unleashed a number of executive actions. You were the acting DHS secretary in the first Trump administration. What are the key differences that you are seeing this time around?
Well, I think there's a number of key differences. I think the biggest one is getting back to actually enforcing both border security law and immigration law. And I talk about those in different respects, because what happens on the border trying to deter the illegal apprehensions, incursions, is very different than what you see in the interior of the country that Tom Homan and some of these enforcement actions that you see on TV and elsewhere are occurring. So I think what we saw over 4 years of the Biden administration was a deliberate attempt not to enforce the law to the fullest extent that you can. And I think what you see here with the Trump administration is actually getting back, letting DHS law enforcement officers, whether it's Border Patrol or ICE removal officers, do their job. And so that's why you see, I think at last count, a little over 4,000 individuals being apprehended and removed since Inauguration Day. And then you're starting to see those apprehension numbers along the border go down as well, right? It's averaged under the Biden administration anywhere from 1,500 upwards to 11,000 in one day at the height back in 22 and 23. And I think yesterday or the day before, there were 50 in one sector. So I think it's starting to work. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and they'll continue to roll out these measures.
What would you say worked for you while you were in office? What still needs to change on the policy front? And, what also would you have done differently?
Well, I think it's a different environment than, I was there all 4 years from 17 to 21. I think that's a different environment than what we see today. A lot of folks said, well, you can just go back to what Trump did in his first term and re-implement that. And I think some of that is true, but the playing field is different today because of the last 4 years. And so you've got to alter your policies that you're putting in place. I think what worked successfully, again, is actually listening to Border Patrol officers, going down there and saying, what is it that you need to do your job better? And they'll talk to you about physical infrastructure, they'll talk to you about technology, but they'll talk to you about policies that they need in place to deter the illegal incursions that they see time and time again. If there is no deterrence, right, which is to say, if there's no consequence to the illegal activity, then you're going to continue to see the cartels push more and more individuals across that border. We saw that in 4 years. There was little deterrence, and that's why the numbers skyrocketed. And so I think getting back to that, making sure you're enforcing the law, you're providing deterrence, and then for me, and I think it's the same way for the new team at the Trump administration, is the asylum system is hopelessly broken. It's what the majority of people use to come across that border to come into the United States, even though the majority of them will never qualify for asylum. And so the question is, how do you find that, that 10% or 11% that truly need asylum protections, and how do you get them those protections quickly? And then how do you get rid of the fraud or the illegitimate claims? I think that's really the key that the new Trump team is certainly looking at. Some of the measures, some of the executive orders to get to that, and how they implement that going forward is going to be the real factor here.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of mass deportations. Yep. This is a huge undertaking. Border Czar Tom Homan, said last night that he has not been happy so far with the pace of ICE arrests and deportations. We know that you're not involved in this administration, but how would you operationalize something like this? What does it actually take to scale up to the kind of numbers that we saw President Trump talk about on the campaign trail?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to remember that ICE removal officers apprehend and remove individuals from the country each and every day, or at least they should be. We know under the last administration, those numbers were way down as far as removals from the interior of the country. And so if you just let them do their job, they know how to do it well. If you take their limitations off, if you tell them, well, you can go after almost anyone and everyone, you're going to prioritize criminal aliens first. But as you go into communities and you pick up what we see are collateral arrest as well, right? So if you have to go into Chicago or New York and the mayor there, has a sanctuary jurisdiction policy that does not allow ICE to go into the jail and pick up 5 criminal aliens, for instance, right? Instead, those 5 are released into the community there in Chicago. Well, now ICE has to go in, find those 5 in the community and pick them up. And when they do that, they often find other illegal aliens with them or around them, and they'll arrest them too. And so we're in this perverse cycle that the sanctuary city jurisdictions are actually making it actually more difficult for ICE, but actually allowing them to pick up more and more illegal aliens in their communities. So I think it's very interesting. I think the goal here for the Trump team is how do you scale, right? Because ICE can remove individuals. They know how to do it. They know how to target. They know how to apprehend. They know how to detain. They know how to put them on a flight line, get them in an airframe, and then remove them. But now you're doing it at numbers that President Trump has talked about in a scale that hasn't been done before. So it's taking the existing kind of standard operating procedure and start to scale it. And so you're going to need more detention space. You're going to need more officers, which we've seen, right? You've got DEA, you've got ATF, and you've got other law enforcement officers helping. So that's great. You're going to eventually need more detention space, and you're going to need more air assets. And we already see DOD helping there. I think I heard the senator talk about maybe that's overkill a little bit. It's very difficult to find these 747s. They're chartered aircraft. There's only so many of them that ICE has access to. So having the Department of Defense with their air assets come in and to help that makes an immense amount of sense, and I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, more on the resource front, and you just kind of hit on this, but if you could drill down on where you believe the priority should be when it comes to funding. I mean, is it tech? Is it more personnel? What exactly does that look like, and where does Congress come in? What do they need from Congress?
Well, I think they probably, as they go forward, they're going to need a lot of additional resources to do a lot of different things that the president wants to see done. So whether it's physical infrastructure along the border, whether it's technology, whether it's more agents and officers, you eventually need to hire up. But hiring ICE officers or CBP officers is not an immediate switch, right? It's usually about 18 months from the time you identify them till you get them into the field. You get them through training, a polygraph, and everything else. So that's where other law enforcement officers around the country fit in there. They're definitely going to need more funding and more resources as far as detention space. And that's definitely where Congress can come in, as well as air assets, the ability to move. So DOD funding, DHS funding, whether they can move some of that money around, I think is probably all on the table. And my guess is in the reconciliation bill, they're going to try to push, the Trump team's probably going to try to push to get a lot of that funding so that you're not dependent on an annual appropriations for the next 4 years.
And you mentioned detention capacity. I mean, at the current pace we're seeing right now, I mean, how quickly do you expect that to fill up?
Well, probably pretty quick. Now, there's a number of other facilities out around the country that state and local law enforcement have access to that you can easily scale up depending on who wants to be willing to help and things of that nature. So I think it's also incumbent on the Trump team, and I know they're doing this, is figuring out a quicker way to, once you identify and detain an illegal alien criminal, and remove them and try to get that time period down from 24 to 48 hours to a matter of a couple of hours. And so if you're able to do that, then you need less detention space. So I think there's a number of challenges that the team has. It's scaling up, it's more resources, but it's also shortening the time window that normally a lot of this takes. If they can shorten it, then they need less resources. They need less money to go out and do some of the normal things that they would otherwise do.
And looking at the last fiscal year, over 270,000 people were deported under the previous administration. Yep. Can the Trump administration exceed that with the resources they currently have at their disposal? Yeah,
I think they can. I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about deportations or removals, what you saw under the Biden administration is, well, let me back up. There's two different ways to count these numbers. One are basically turnbacks that you get at the border, that someone comes in and you're able to remove them very quickly. The Biden administration counted all of that as far as individuals being deported. I don't think that that's what the Trump team is looking at. I think that what they're looking at numbers are in the interior of the country. So they go into Chicago or New York or Dallas or Houston, and they actually arrest individuals in the interior of the country and they remove them. I think that's where their focus and their priority will be as far as, numbers or what that looks like. The previous team, the Biden administration, their numbers on interior removals were at an all-time low. Most of those numbers that you just cited came from just turning people around at the border. And so that's important, but you're losing a big chunk of what you need to do and the deterrence. I think that can't be understated enough. A lot of what DHS law enforcement does is make sure you're holding people accountable, but you're also trying to deter illegal behavior. And so a lot of these images that you see using the military, it's all to send a signal that, the times are different than the last 4 years, that U.S. immigration law is going to be enforced and there's going to be consequences if you choose to break the law and stay here. There will be consequences. So I think it's really, really important that some of those images get out, that you now have the use of the military. And when I say that, I don't say that, just flip it. When you have cartels along that border that control almost the entire southern border on the Mexican side, they are, Border Patrol is outmatched in this capability. And so having DOD resources there makes a big difference.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the ICE raids we've been seeing. I mean, in this idea of, prioritizing public safety, national security threats. There was some data that 48% of those arrested on Sunday, had non-violent offenses or no offenses. They did cross the border illegally, of course. So in your view, do you feel like violent offenders are still the priority for this administration, or to get the kind of numbers that we know that President Trump wants to see? Is that why we're seeing them widen this pool?
Well, I think a couple of things here. I've heard the president, Tom Homan, continue to talk about going after the worst of the worst. So those are the violent, criminal, illegal aliens. These are individuals that cross the border illegally and have likely either committed another crime here in the United States as well. But then there's also 1.5 million final orders of removal, right? So these are individuals that have come into the country that have applied for some type of relief or protection. They've gone to an immigration judge probably twice, maybe even 3 different times, and every time the immigration judge has said, you don't have a legal right to remain in the United States and you need to leave. There's 1.5 million individuals that have gotten that order and have chosen to stay in the United States. Okay, so they've had due process. They've had due process at the expense of the taxpayer extensively. And that is a population that they're also looking at, that they should be removed as well. If you want to enforce the law, you need to enforce the law. But made up of that 1.5 million are probably individuals that are not criminals. These are individuals that have crossed over, they've sought protection, they don't qualify for it. And so yes, you're going to see a little bit of everything. You're going to see convicted criminals or definitely violent criminals, but you're going to see these final orders of removal trying to be enforced as well. We have visa overstayers, folks that come in on a business visa or visitor visa, for a 6-month period, for instance. They'll overstay their visa for 2 years. They have been continuously. Those are individuals that also should be removed from the country. So you're going to get, I've heard this, debate of you only need to go after the criminal ones and not the civil, criminals that just cross the border and it's a civil case. I think you need to enforce the law. And I hope that the vast majority of them will be criminal aliens. That's where they should focus. But as you go into places like Chicago, New York, and Denver, and elsewhere, and you pick up those collateral arrests, right? So under the Biden administration, I'll just give you an example. If you had to target a criminal alien in a neighborhood and you would go into the house and there were 6 other criminal aliens as well, they didn't pick up any of those. They only picked up the one individual they were targeting. Now, I think for most Americans, they would say, that's crazy. You should remove all of the criminals from my neighborhood or my community. So that's what they're currently doing, but they will pick up collateral arrest.
I wanted to also talk about the military's involvement in the president's immigration agenda. I guess what exactly do you see, what is the administration exactly asking the U.S. military on this front? I mean, how much do you believe that they will be relying on military resources and troops to really carry out their policy plans?
Well, I think in two different respects. One is along the border, and we've had DOD assets along that border both under President Trump and under President Biden, doing certain activities along the border, transportation, mechanical work and other things that frees up Border Patrol, that frees up ICE to actually go out and do their job. That gets rid of some of the, I'm not going to say administrative duties, but not in using Border Patrol officers with their arrest authority along that border to get them out there to do that job. And so DOD assets can come in along the border and supplement that. We've had that in the form of National Guard for some time. You're seeing more of that, obviously, today. And then on the interior, actually helping ICE and other law enforcement officers on the back end of once you identify someone and arrest them, apprehend them, and then helping them move around the country and eventually out of the country. So utilizing DOD expertise and logistics in some of the other duties that they would otherwise trained to do. We'll just have them trained to do it on the border, and at the same time helping Border Patrol do their job. I think it's really, really important message, and I don't think it shouldn't be lost on people that the last 4 years was a disaster along that border, the worst crisis that we have ever seen. And so this idea that, we're just going to fix it with normal Border Patrol assets and ICE assets, that's not reality. You're going to have to surge resources in there to try to get a steady state back along that border. And once you do, maybe you can demobilize some of those, but it's going to take a significant amount of time.
When you get into this idea of the military being involved in interior enforcement, we don't know the full extent to which this administration is going to use the military in this way. But I guess what do you see as the biggest potential challenges there? Is it on the legal front? Is it internal resistance in any way? Lack of training? That's another thing that has been brought up in conversations I've had.
I think it's really important to listen to folks like Tom Homan and others because they'll tell you exactly what they're doing. And I think this is part of either the legacy media or others trying to scare folks, right? We've heard, they're going to go around neighborhoods kicking in doors. That's not how ICE operates. That's not what they do. They target individual illegal aliens. You need ICE officers that have immigration enforcement authority, very, very specific to what they do out there arresting individuals, what they're using DEA for, ATF officers. They don't have immigration enforcement unless it's conveyed upon them. But what they're asking them to do is, while ICE officers go into the front door, why don't you watch the back door? Why don't you watch around the corners for officer safety? So allowing more ICE officers on the front line using their immigration arrest authority to go into and target these aliens and pick them up. They're using DOD in the same way. So once they identify them, detain them, having DOD use some of their resources and assets. I don't think that you will see soldiers in camouflage fatigues in downtown New York City arresting aliens. I just don't think that you'll see that. We could get to that point, but I don't envision that. It's not what the president or Tom Homan or Secretary Noem have talked about to date. It's using those assets, other federal law enforcement assets, in a different way that puts ICE on the front line, allows them to make the arrest, but then alleviates ICE officer needs on some of the back-end duties.
You also mentioned this use of military aircraft for deportations. We've already seen some of those visuals coming from the White House. Thinking about what happened with Colombia this weekend, I guess, is there a risk at all with using these military aircraft to deport migrants? Is there a risk in potentially agitating countries who already have been cooperating with immigration enforcement?
First of all, it's a mix of how you remove individuals. It's using in some cases, military aircraft. ICE does have access to a number of charter aircraft that they're using as well. So it's a mix. It's not just one or the other. I do think it sends a strong message if you have a gray hole, a military aircraft flying into a country and removing individuals back to that home country. It's starting to send a message. And I think that's a big part of what the Trump administration is trying to do, to say these last 4 years were it should not be the standard operating procedure of the U.S. government. We're actually going to enforce the law. And showing images of folks on aircraft, on the flight line, aircraft flying back to a home country, it all starts to send the message that if you choose to break our laws and you come into the country illegal, there are consequences, and you will be removed back home, right? So now someone has to make a calculated decision. Do they want to risk their life savings, pay a cartel member $10,000, $20,000, whatever it might be, to make it into the United States only to be removed back to your home country? They may want to think about that, that's not a value proposition, because we're not doing a catch and release scheme anymore, that it just allows them to stay in the country for any number of years.
Yeah, you just hit on something where I wanted to go next, which was this idea of the PR that has come along with the enforcement we've seen over the last week. I mean, I'm thinking, I was at the White House press briefing yesterday, and they're showing mugshots of people they've arrested, military aircraft. Tom Homan, he was on Dr. Phil's show. They were showing videos of arrests. Secretary Noem, same thing, showing visuals that she's out there participating in this enforcement. I guess, what do you see as the value in this? I mean, I see there's a political element to it, but what else does that accomplish?
Well, I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. One is an education campaign, because I think there are some on the left and others that want people to think that the only individuals coming into the country are women and children, and if you take enforcement action against them, then somehow you're cruel and unusual. And I think what the White House and others are trying to do is, there's actually some very bad individuals in the United States that have come in, whether it's the last 4 years or whenever, that are in your communities. They are sex offenders. They are convicted criminals. They picked up someone on the terror watch list as well in the last week or so. There are bad individuals. So I think part of this is educating the American people that it's not, the sympathetic, what you see, women and children, although there are those that cross that border without a doubt. But a lot of these children fall between 15 and 17, right? And in South America, Central America, that is military age, that is recruitment for gangs, and a lot of them come over that way. And so I think part of it is educating the American people about what's going on, who are they picking up. And so you get images like we saw at the White House press briefing where they have the dossier of who that individual is, trying to let you know that this is about protecting communities. This is about making sure that we stop these individuals and we stop the cartels from trafficking women, children, males, whoever it might be, into the country. And so I think part of this is trying to change the narrative here. And look, the American people bought this, and they're all for it. November 5th, the election, they agreed with where the president wanted to go, and as far as enforcing immigration law, and that's what we see today. The second piece is obviously the deterrence piece of these images, is making sure that the cartels know, but that the people that pay the cartels know as well, right? So the cartels, what we classically have seen is they will tell these migrants any number of outlandish stories about how you can get into the U.S. and stay in the U.S. But I think what the Trump team is trying to do is trying to message directly to these migrants is, doesn't matter what the cartels tell you, I'm here telling you that if you come into the country illegally, if the first act that you want to come into the country is to break the law, there's going to be consequences to that. And I think that's what we're seeing here as well.
Yeah, I mean, you just said it. It was a huge issue for voters this election. But we also know from Trump's first term that there is a certain point when a number of voters view some policies as too cruel.
Sure.
And so, there is a ton of agreement on going after criminals, securing the border. We see agreement on both sides of the aisle with that. But some voters did take issue with family separation from the first term. I guess now, with where the electorate stands, where do you see that line?
Well, I think it's, again, this is about putting policies in place that protect not only American communities, American citizens, law enforcement officers, but actually the migrants themselves. And so when you talk about, zero tolerance during the Trump administration, what people lose sight of is over 330,000 children during the Biden administration have been lost in the immigration system, according to the New York Times and others. And so that's the system that has been put in place for the last 4 years, an unlimited amount of human trafficking of children coming in. And so I think as the American people start to understand what the Trump team is trying to do with these measures, it's actually to stop this human trafficking of children coming into the country and stopping that at the source before they ever arrive. And again, it's getting back to, there are people all over the world, from Mexico or wherever it might be, that actually do qualify for asylum protections under U.S. law. And the question is, how do you get them, how do you identify them quickly and get them asylum protections quickly within a matter of weeks or months instead of the 6 years it takes now, right? So you want to protect the vulnerable, those that qualify under our law to get the protections, but discouraging everyone else that will never qualify for asylum and providing them other resources, which this is where we get into the State Department and other assets that the U.S. government has to make, particularly in Mexico and Central America and others, make their home countries more palatable to stay, jobs and opportunities and other things.
And on that, I mean, another line for people, is this idea of immigrants who are here, contributing to our economy. Sure. And this huge part of the labor force. Yep. And so, I mean, what do you view as the impact of, deportations of this scale on a number of industries, whether you're talking about agriculture, hospitality? I mean, does this leave us with a hole in the labor force and ultimately lead to inflation?
Well, I don't think so. So there's a number of legal visas that individuals use, whether it's H-2A, H-2B, H-1B, a variety, to come in to work here in the United States for a period of time, whether it's seasonal, whether it's for 6 months and then they leave and they come back. There's no doubt that that needs to be reformed. I wish Congress would actually do that. A lot of our visa programs have not been touched in probably 20 years, and I think what was needed for the economy 20 years ago is very different today. I think the part of your question is the illegal workforce that is employed in certain industries. And I hear this a lot, particularly in the ag industry, saying, well, if you go and pick up everyone, then the ag industry is going to be decimated. Again, that's not what the Trump team is currently doing. That's not who they're targeting. They're targeting criminal aliens. Now, if they're criminal aliens working in certain industries, yes, they're going to be picked up and they're going to be removed. But they're not targeting industries. They're not targeting individuals. They're going after the violent criminals first. And we got to think about, there's 600 to 700,000 criminal aliens that have been released into American communities today. So if you're just looking at that set of population, plus the 1.5 million final orders of removal, you're well over 2 million individual targets that the Trump team has. Even if they're able to do that over the course of a couple of years, that's a tremendous amount of people removed from the country.
Well, I could ask you a million more questions, but I think we do need to leave it there. So thank you, Secretary Wolf, and thank you all for joining us today to discuss, newly enacted immigration policies under the new administration and what's to come on long overdue reforms to enhance border security. Stay tuned for more announcements on several other policy areas we will be having over the next few weeks focused on trade, energy, agriculture, and healthcare policy for our Politico First 100 Days Breakfast series. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we will see you all very, very soon.